Shalom. Since the Arab Spring broke into our lives, we find ourselves in a chronic situation of uncertainty and instability in the Middle East, with various sort of turmoil surprising us and all sorts of events. The UAE, I mean, inter alia, myself and other people were taken aback, and I thought it would be wonderful to talk to some of our Arab affairs correspondents, because they really live it 24/7, and they are connected with their thumbs on the pulse of what's going on in the Arab world. So I'm delighted to open this panel. Mrs. Smadar Perry, the senior Arab affairs commentator, and the Middle East, Oded Granot, in the Cannes 11 Arab affairs correspondent, and of course, Roy Case. So Oded Granot, Smadar Perry, and Roy Case. Smadar, I'd like to open with you. Do you find this Arab initiative, has it sort of faded away? Is it died? We know that the order, we know that there was first some kind of permanent settlement and then normalization. Is this something, does this remove it from the agenda now, the UAE agreement? Are you asking me in writing or orally? It's of course all orally. As if this is something written. So, well, practically, the Palestinian issue is on the agenda. Saudi Arabia, for example, announced that they would not join it until the Palestinians' issue is solved. And after all, they had their initiative. So have the Palestinians been abandoned? No, but the question is, who is going to be elected to the presidency in the United States? Will it be President Trump or someone else? And that will be an opening to change. But let's go back to those Arab states, to Egypt and Jordan, that we have peace accords with. Is that model of this peace with the UAE that we're going towards warm, normalized relationships, relations and ties? Does that mean that we, the intelligentsia in Egypt and other people who have sort of felt against us, do you think that we're now going towards normalization with them as well? I doubt it. You might find various expressions in the Twitter, because that's the only way they can express themselves. In the papers, it doesn't actually exist, but I don't think there will be a real breakthrough, because I think the Jordanians and the Egyptians prefer the ties as they are. And they will have to grapple with their tweeters in their countries. And I believe they'll be able to succeed to grapple and contend with this kind of situation of what they write. We look at the Middle East. There's a sort of diversity in the situation wherein we find ourselves with the Arab countries. In Iran, there are other countries in Libya, Yemen, and in Syria, some of them as well, who find themselves after horrific strife. But we have those where there is a struggle for their image, for their path, if it's in Iraq or Lebanon and Iran. So you have a sort of diversity. Is there still some kind of Arab agenda that is common to all of them? Is there something that unites, a common denominator that unites this Arab world? well, it'll be a decade that we'll be celebrating to the Arab Spring. They thought, I mean, it really wasn't a spring. It was, they sort of did, they as if patterned it upon the Berlin Wall falling, and they thought that there would a democratization in the Arab wall that would be created. But unfortunately, we didn't get any closer to that whatsoever. We got closer to an anarchy. And now, if we're waiting for the Vox Populi to be heard, now, instead of what they thought that the actual regimes would be toppled, but now, instead of that, all the regimes are aiming to hit at their peoples. Look at Assad and other people. So the result nowadays is that we're closer to tyranny and dictatorships than anything, than an Arab Spring. I mean, after all, there isn't any common denominator. I mean, the Arab League is totally split off. But there are a couple of, that you can say, sort of certain lights at the end of the tunnel, as that we said, with this dictatorship and anarchy. First of all, a marginalization of the Israeli and Palestinian conflict. The moment there is that kind of turmoil, suddenly people realize that that is not the reason for the fact that there is an absence of peace in the Middle East. And also the political Islam's decrease in their importance. They talk about it less. The UAE are recognized as Israel as a political entity. That's very nice. But more important than that, suddenly Israel is on the map even from a religious point of view. MBZ is building, actually, they're bringing the Quran verses, actually quoting situations like that, and that has tremendous value embedded in it. So it's not only, so this marginalization is so important, and also the fact that the Emirates and the Gulf states have suddenly become much more important, and they are now much more sort of seen. I mean, how did it start? It started from Egypt to Saudi Arabia, and then to Iran, and then you spoke about a certain territory that was actually given back to the Saudi Arabia. So look at MBZ, a young leader with various aspirations, but does he want to be a regional force? But boy, yes, he's got lots of ammunition, and he's got the an air force. Undoubtedly, it's not quite in his hands. He's not quite the leader of a regional force, but yes, they are marching towards normalization. You spoke to Smadar about the Saudi Arabian initiative. Unfortunately, we find it in critical condition, just like Corona. It's being actually resuscitated. It's now on a respirator, like in COVID cases. So instead of, Israel giving back the land and the territories, etc., they're saying instead of that, because that hasn't happened, let us now give some incentives to Israel. Then there'll be more security. That is what they believe, and Israel will progress, and sort of the situation will improve in such a way. I'm going to ask you a challenging question. In Intel, they always say that the difficulty is to predict the future. It's very difficult to do so, and also because one's imagination fails to do so. But I would like you to imagine for a moment. There's always a quarrel between whether this upheaval, which is a better name than the Arab Spring, as it was coined, is it still going on, or has it faded away? So I'd like you to answer that. And also I'd like you if we assume that it hasn't concluded, then what other surprises can we expect in the future? I mean, please go wild. Don't hold back with your sort of suppositions. Now, the question is whether this turmoil has sort of really exhausted itself, yes or no. I think that, yes, democracy will now shine from the skies, but unfortunately it hasn't happened. Anyone who analyzes this region can see that. But if we look at what has happened over the last 2 years in the Arab world, I mean, there are various countries that we talk about less. Here in Israel, Sudan and Algeria, where we saw real upheavals. Omar al-Bashir, for example, and Afrika, we saw they were ginormous, and suddenly they have been toppled. And I think that the Arab leaders know that full-heartedly. So if you look at the various regimes, I think more than ever now, they do want to ensure their survivability. So if you, even for example, in the context of the UAE and Israel's peace agreement, I think that MBZ took into account that there would be a reaction from within, and you haven't seen demonstrations in Dubai or Abu Dhabi, but also they wanted to take into account the Palestinian reaction and Hezbollah, etc. So of course it still interests the Arab world. How will they react and what will happen? But I think that ultimately regimes are more prepared for such upheavals, at least in some of the places. Sisi, for example, in Egypt, who has ensured the continuation of his regime, I think, until 2024, when he can be re-elected, even until 2036. So they're now better prepared, and the oppression is much more significant. And so you can see where there are Iraq and Lebanon, for example, you can see different kinds of regimes. Just over the last year, you haven't got this sort of omnipotent leader. I mean, but it's not like in other countries. No, I mean, I just prepared my question in advance. Lebanon, for example, this terrible explosion at the port, it's not only the port, it's a total explosion of that country, an implosion of the country, of infrastructure, the economy, their waste, the refuge is being sort of piling up in the streets. Can you, when you look sort of at Lebanon in the future, can you seeing it sort of falling apart into various cantons and federations? We spoke about that in the Iraqi and even Syrian context. What is going to actually happen to our neighbor? Will this leak over to us if it happens to Lebanon? I think that ultimately, when you look at Lebanon, there are still too many power groups there that have vested interest in retaining the situation as is. In other words, the political cliques, even if they don't like each other, the Hezbollah camp and the Sunni one, the Christian one, ultimately they don't want to break this whole package up. But the public is very vibrant at the moment. And the connection between them, and there's tremendous tension there to such a degree that you can't even explain it. I mean, look at, for example, the people went to the streets against the regime if it was because of the refuge that's building up in the streets or other things. And now if you look at Hezbollah, when it went into Syria and Israel, they said, oh, there will be tremendous fermentation amongst the Shiites. And they did succeed in overcoming that. But now we saw the explosion in Beirut that they connected to the Hezbollah and others. It's still not a critical mass in the Shiite camp. We haven't seen that as yet. What we have seen, and I think that will continue and remain with us, is that there is a tension between the Sunni camp, the moderate camp, the Emirates, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, and other states, as opposed to the Shiite camp of Iran, Syria, and Hezbollah that have not said their last word as yet. I just want to mention about Lebanon. Based on their constitution, they have to always have a Christian president since 1943. I'm waiting for the moment that if suddenly there's an explosion and Nasrallah suddenly says no, since there's a very high percent of Shiites in Lebanon, then I ought to be the president. And don't forget, he's got the population. That strength he may suddenly come and claim, and then you'll suddenly find Lebanon under the sort of the auspices of a Shiite force. And they don't want that to happen. We don't want it to happen, but they might reach a state of anarchy, and that'll have implications. So if we're talking about a moderate camp that oppresses the people, as opposed to a radical camp that could really try and take over in all sorts of places, even like Iran. Just wanted to add something here. I think that we have withdrawn back to the situation we're talking about the Sunni and the Shiite camps, and that is what has happened. The Sunnis somehow cohere, and the Shiites do the same. There may be sort of internal controversy, but they are that against that. And in the Arab League, everything that happened was basically a joke. I don't know if you saw, but there was an interview that we had here today with Hayom, and he said that he spoke about with Mohammed bin Salman, the MBS, the Saudi heir. And in the interview, he said, leave me, the Iranians and everyone else really are killing me, the men in the street. But I don't want to go there. But that's what I want to talk to you about. Are the reactions in the street so bad? I think the people who write their reactions on Twitter are the more enlightened group, the sort of the intelligentsia that are closer to us. In other words, they're in the social networks, there's a kind of misleading situation. Yes, but they haven't really got true import there. They're not a real force. There was a survey carried out in the Arab world just a few months ago, and they said that there's a dramatic decrease of the Arab world, the people in the street, in what is happening between the Palestinians and the Israelis. It's as if it interests them a lot less. You spoke about the Sunni camp. I think that camp, in the context of what we're talking about, they are moderate, and we should pay attention to them, because Egypt, the Emirates, and the other, what is happening there is against what is happening in that Sunni group. Now look at Turkey, for example. They are no less of a threat than Iran. Look what's happening in Libya, Syria, and the Middle East. Look what they're doing in the Mediterranean, for example. They're no less of a threat than Iran. I think we spoke about the green wave with Tunisia and Morsi, and this is dissipated. And so now don't forget that Israelis can still go into Turkey till this very day. But it's still no, but what I'm talking about, a decrease of the political Islam, which is in our favor, the Israelis. And thanks to Sisi, for example, so many positive things have happened. For example, the eradication of the Islamic State, ISIS. But there's an alliance that isn't steadfast, although there is a military camp in Qatar. But if you look at what's happening with Trump, who wants a big achievement, he wants to remove the sanctions over Qatar, and inter alia, he wants a cooling of the political ties of the, and if he does achieve what he would like to achieve with that kind of cooling of relations and the removal of those sanctions, if he does, then I think that the Erdogan's aspirations to be a hegemon in the Middle East will have to sort of wait on the back burner, just like the Iranian leader as well. They both have aspirations of hegemony, but they haven't disappeared altogether, but they find themselves in a rather problematic reality. The fact that they can't export their oil, and the nuclear issues, and Corona, of course, on top of everything, and Turkey, with also an economic crisis. It's not number 15 position in the world from an economic point of view. Do you remember? Well, let me tell you, I mean, they try and find people that they can work with. From, yes, I think from naught, they suddenly spiraled to 100 with problems with their neighbors. But I think that Erdogan did manage to stop things happening in Libya that they didn't want, and he's signed an agreement that enables him to have drilling rights, more significant drilling rights in the Mediterranean, and so, I mean, for a moment, I know I wanted to ask you another question vis-a-vis the Arab League questions, vis-a-vis the interference of Iran and Turkey into internal issues of the Arab states. Oh, okay, so I'll tell you where that happens. Where do they encounter? They meet via Zoom. No, but they meet in Egypt. I think exactly this, Iran, Turkey, in the Arab League, isn't there some kind of news, a statement that non-Arab forces are now dictating the tone in the Middle East? And I'm adding Russia, that's also permeated Egypt and Libya as well. And I think that we're talking about forces and even aircraft carriers and other things that we're talking about. They've got the force. So where are the Arabs? I think that these states that have hegemonious inspirations, they will not succeed in leading the Arab world. When the Iranians wanted to draw everyone around them vis-a-vis the sports games, none of the Arab countries came, because it said the actual, it said the Arab, it didn't say the Arab Gulf, it said they called it another name, the Persian Gulf, so of course they didn't even turn up. So, but if you take the Islam model, Morsi, the Islamist said, excuse me, thank you, I've got my own Islam. So through a hypoxis, they will not succeed in the way they think they're going to succeed in actually leading all the Arab world. They tried, for example, one of the attempts was, for example, to unite them around Jerusalem, and that didn't succeed either. So I think that Abu Mazen, who I know personally, for him to come and say that if there's no normalization, there'll be no agreement with Israel. But if you're saying that the Arabs won't be able to come through Israel to go and pray at the Al-Aqsa mosque, that is a sort of a double-edged sword. So I think that we have to, the Palestinians, for example, no one has said they're actually who is going to actually be responsible for that holy triangle of holy sites, etc. I mean, the whole argument around that is something very significant. I know that you're in friction with the Arab world and everything, but I'm going to start by asking each of you about a personal experience that really can perhaps present a personal experience about your ties with the Arab world and the connection with Israel. I think that 8 days ago, I was sitting at home in a very interesting dialogue via Zoom. We were 4 Israelis and 8 Lebanese people. It was fascinating. Of course, we're talking about very enlightened, distinguished people who functionaries, dignitaries, and we only asked questions. We didn't express our opinions. It was fascinating to hear them. It was just after the explosion. And I think they succeeded in persuading me that Israel should not come close to us. We're not asking for help. Please don't give it to us. We are deliberating our own problems, and one of their biggest problems is how to preserve the Lebanese, that they will remain in Lebanon. I once did a course in the United States, a security course in the INSS in the States. And the only person who came, they were the only people who didn't talk to me, were the Lebanese. All the other people, all the military people from all the other Arab countries spoke to me. I was recently in Dubai, and I had an interesting experience there. We were walking along the promenade in Dubai. We were taking photographs, and we were filming there. And some security people took our names and then he said to the photographer, "Hey, what, you're going to arrest them and detain them? Because you don't want a diplomatic incident, do you? We're now having peace talks with them." So they immediately turned around and walked off. I think that symbolizes enough, no? It certainly does signify it. So, yes. So wait. I don't think that the Israelis should stampede and run to Abu Dhabi yet, but wait, it's interesting. Now, with what speed will the Saudis open their airspace for Israelis? I don't think, yes, they'll open that, but I'm not sure they're going to open an embassy that quickly. But if they do take those steps for the whole issue of the holy sites, yes. And the fact that they're accepting us as actually that we're actually there, that we exist, that we're on the map. Now, Khashoggi, for example, brought Begin a proposal from the Saudi king of $100 billion, so that there would be $100 million, that there should be a flag, a Saudi flag on the Islam holy sites. And he told him just to go away, and he didn't accept it, Begin, at the time. Now, but I think that if you look at the situation, I think that so much could have happened earlier on, if you look at the situation nowadays. Now, let's just go back for a moment to various other issues. I've only got a minute left. We saw that the Iranians are oppressing and assisting to oppress their masses in Iraq as well, with the oil demonstrations and in other places. We've always said that the Iranians are stirring the actual soup and the broth with the actual other leaders of regimes. And they've always said that. Are they still doing that? Is that still the sentiment towards them? They're sitting back, biting their lips. They're eating a great deal less, but because of the actual sanctions and waiting and praying for Biden's election. If it doesn't happen, then I think there are going to be very serious steps with their nuclear program taken against him if he's not elected Biden. So I believe that the Iranians will become our friends. They don't want the Ayatollahs. It's a very high percentage are those under the age of 40. They want the sneakers and the Western culture. I believe that it will happen ultimately, and they will be our best friends once again. I think we ought to pay attention that Iran is acting outwardly in the skies, but most specifically on the ground in the countries surrounding us should truly trouble us because they are doing things. So it will be continued on Twitter and on the social network. And now let us move over to the Iranian chapter of this conference.